More than 30 years ago, the Project on the History of Black Writing began its investment in preserving and recovering the history of Black writing. Today, we remain committed to creating critical spaces for teaching, learning, researching, and presenting Black literature, both in the US and globally. As such, we are very pleased to present our fourth webinar in Black Poetry After the Black Arts Movement, a summer institute funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our special guest today is the poet Jericho Brown, who joins us from Emory University, where he's a professor of literature and creative writing. I'm Claire Schwartz, PhD candidate in African American Studies, American Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale. A quick logistical note before we get started. In order to facilitate interaction with our guests today, we will be using two of the tools that you will find in the upper left-hand corner of your webinar window. We will use the chat tool to provide immediate feedback. Think of it as a place for virtual applause and encouragement. We will use the Q&A tool as the place to collect questions for the poet to answer in the course of the webinar. You are encouraged to use both actively. You might start by using the chat window to provide a special virtual welcome to our guest today, poet Jericho Brown. In a conversation for the Kenyon Review, Jericho Brown was asked to craft his poetic credo. He responded in part, "Every poem is a love poem. Every poem is a political poem. So say the masters. Every love poem is political. Every political poem must fall in love." In her poem, Winnie, that master Gwendolyn Brooks writes, "I pass you my poem. A poem doesn't do everything for you. You were supposed to go on with your thinking." I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Brown today, who has graciously agreed to be here so that we might together, poetically, which as he reminds us is to say, in lovely and politically, go on with our thinking. Jericho Brown earned a BA from Dillard University, an MFA from the University of New Orleans, and a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. He's the author of 2 collections of poetry. His first book, Please, 2008, received tremendous praise, including the 2009 American Book Award. His more recent collection, The New Testament, 2014, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award and was named one of the best books of the year by Library Journal, Cold Front, and the Academy of American Poets. His poems have been published widely in The Nation, The New Republic, The New Yorker, Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. Professor Brown is the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Red Loaf Writers Conference, the Krakow Poetry Seminar, and the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. He's an associate professor in English and creative writing at Emory University. These awards matter. Still, Professor Brown calls us back to the real work of the poem. Poetry is not about how many prizes you win, and it's not even about how many people buy your books, he writes. Poetry is about how much space any one poem holds in any human heart. So by way of entry into our conversation, I'll just say that in my own human heart, Professor Brown's poems hold sacred space, and I'm so excited to be here. So I was just wondering if you would start by reading a few of your poems, Professor Brown.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Claire?
I can hear you.
Good. That was so nice. I like it when people say nice things about me. Okay, I'll read a poem. Labor. I spent what light Saturday sent sweating and learned to cuss, cutting grass for women kind enough to say they couldn't tell the damned difference between their mowed lawns and their vacuumed carpets just before handing over a $5 bill rolled tighter than a joint and asking me in to change a few light bulbs. I called those women old because they wouldn't move out of a chair without my help or walk without a hand at the base of their backs. I called them old, and they must have been. They're all dead now, dead and in the earth I once tended. The loneliest people have the earth to love, and not one friend their own age. only mothers to baby them, and big sisters to boss them around. Women they want to please and pray for the chance to say please to. I don't do that kind of work anymore. My job is to look at the childhood I hated and say, I once had something to do with my hands. I'm going to read a persona poem. I'll read a poem in the voice of one of my favorite poets, the poet Langston Hughes. Langston's Blues. O blood of the river of songs, O songs of the river of blood, let me lie down. Let my words lie sound in the mouths of men repeating invocations pure and perfect as a moan that mounts in the mouth of Bessie Smith. Blues for the angels kicked out of heaven. Blues for the angels who miss them still. Blues for my people and what water they know. Oh, weary drinkers drinking from the bloody river. Why go to heaven with Harlem so close? Why sing of rivers with fathers of our own to miss? I remember mine and taste a stain like blood coursing the body of a man chased by a mob. I write his running, his sweat. Here he climbs a poplar for the sky, but it is only sky. The river, follow me, you'll see. We tried to fly and learned we couldn't swim. Dear singing river full of my blood, are we as loud under water? Is it blood that binds brothers, or is it the Mississippi running through the fattest vein of America? When I say home, I mean I wanted to write some lines. I wanted to hear the blues, but here I am swimming the river again. What runs through the fat veins of a drowned body? What America can a body call home? When I say Congo, I mean blood. When I say Nile, I mean blood. When I say Euphrates, I mean if only you knew what blood we have in common. So much in Louisiana, they call a man like me red, and red was too dark for my daddy, and my daddy was too dark for America. He ran like a man from my mother and me, and my mother's sobs are the songs of Bessie Smith, who wears more feathers than death. Oh, the death my people refuse to die. When I was 18, I wrote down the river, though I couldn't win a race. Climbed a tree that winter, then fell flat on my wet, red face. Line after line, I read all the time, but there was nothing I could do about race. So maybe just 2 or 3 more poems. Second language. You come with a little black string tied around your tongue, knotted to remind where you came from and why you left behind photographs of people whose names need no pronouncing. How do you say God now that the night rises sooner? How dare you wake to work before any alarm? I am the man asking. The great grandson made so by the dead tenant farmers promised a plot of land to Hugh. They thought they could own the dirt they were bound to. In that part of the country, a knot is something you get after getting knocked down, and story means lie. In your part of the country, class means school, this room where we practice words like rope in our hope to undo your tongue so you can tell a lie. or break a promise or grow like a story. And I think my good friend Lauren Parker's out there. She likes this poem, so I'll read it for her. Stand. Peace on this planet, our guns glowing hot. We lay there together as if we were getting something done. It felt like planting a garden or planning a meal for a people who still need feeding. All that touching or barely touching, not saying much, not adding anything, the cushion of it, the skin, an occasional sigh, all seemed like work worth mastering. I'm sure somebody died while we made love. Somebody killed somebody black. I thought then of holding you as a political act. I may as well have held myself. We didn't stand for one thought, didn't do a damn thing, Derek. And though you left me, I'm glad we didn't. And I'll finish with this poem that I wrote after finding out about and being confounded by what I found out about the deaths of people like Tyrone White and Jesus Huerta and Sandra Bland. And that list is much longer than that, although I certainly wish it was not as long as it is. Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots and the ants and the roaches who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass, more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will kill me, the same way most Americans do. I promise you, cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise that if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the brand new shiny bullet fished from the folds of my brain. Thank you.
Thank you. Your work broadly makes me think a lot about questions of legacy, tradition, and kinship. And I'm thinking in particular about Langston's Blues, which engages both, I guess, Terence Hayes' poem in the more recent past, and then also, of course, Langston Hughes. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit to what poems do with history that other kinds of archives maybe can't, or what poems bring in particular, or what histories you bring in particular into and through your poems.
So there's this poem that I love by Mark Doty called Charlie Howard's Descent. Do you know this poem, Claire?
Mm-hmm.
I love this poem so much. Part of what I love about the poem is that the poem goes on for a very long time before there's a speaker. It's almost as if the poem is happening in third person. And then all of a sudden, like halfway, I mean, it's like a 3 or 4 page poem, right? And all of a sudden, halfway through the poem, somebody Mark Doty, I imagine, says, I imagine he took the insults in and made of them a place to live. We learn to use the names because they are there. I love those lines. That's really beautiful. That's good music, right? But then the poem sort of goes back into third person. But that moment of first person, that moment where the speaker says, I imagine, is a moment where the poet and the speaker in that poem is getting us ready for possibility. And then, as you know, Claire, what happens at the end of that poem is the speaker imagines, he doesn't say he imagines it, like he has the image of these boys throwing Charlie Howard over the bridge, killing him because he cannot swim. And when and then all of a sudden the speaker says, or this didn't happen at all. Now we know if we look up Charlie Howard that it did happen. We know that there was a supposedly gay man. What's interesting to me about the poem is that the poem is very clear that the reason why Charlie Howard is tortured in this small town by all of these people isn't because he's gay. It's because he doesn't conform to what they think his gender should conform to. But that's a whole nother story. What's interesting to me about the poem at its end is Mark Doty imagines Charlie Howard climbing back up the bridge and saying he forgives them, that he knew that they didn't believe him when he said he couldn't swim. And then he says at the end of the poem, and he blesses his killers in a way that only the dead can afford to bless your killers, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember those lines exactly. But what I love about that is the reimagining, right? And I think that's what poems allow us to do with history that plain history does not. By plain, I don't mean that pejoratively, but that strict history, I should say, does not allow us to do. It allows us to reimagine the past and to add to the past our imaginings, so that with that, we can add to the past certain possibilities. And if we can add to the past certain possibilities, we can then begin to see different kinds of futures where the past does not repeat itself, or where the past can repeat itself on our terms. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think that's what poems do. And that's what I hope my poems do. Part of the reason why the Langston Hughes poem has so many references to things that are in and from the past is that I need those references to be there. I need those allusions to be there for me to work with, so that I can figure out where the hell is Jericho Brown in all of this, right? And at what point is Langston Hughes a representative of me? I mean, you know, a persona means mask, right? How is this poem a mask for the real me? How can I look at what Langston Hughes saw and still see it in present day, right? For people of color, for Black people in particular, right? How can I still see those things and then translate them so that I can change them in my own life and make a world where this does not happen, or at least happens less. Hopefully, having read the poem, or having read a poem like Langston's Blues, or having read a poem like Charlie Howard's Descent, hopefully fewer people want to throw people off of bridges. So that's what I hope poems do with history, that history might not do on its own. Does that answer you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There are several things I want to ask you about, and we also have questions coming in. So I guess I'll just ask Laura Vrana, who is joining us, who is a member of the Black Poetry After the Black Arts Movement Institute this summer, asks that Langston Hughes persona poem has fascinated me since I first read it. Could you speak a little bit more about your aesthetic relationship to Hughes?
I'm really interested in how, so my favorite poem by Langston Hughes is actually a 3-line poem that a lot of people don't know or talk about, but I talk about it all the time. It's a poem called Suicide's Note. The poem is Suicide's Note. The calm, cool face of the river asked me for a kiss. And it goes pretty fast, so I'm going to read it again or say it again. Suicide's note. The calm, cool face of the river asked me for a kiss. And what I love about Langston, and he alludes to this in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, an essay that I love. When he talks about the blues, he calls the blues laughter mixed with tears, ironic laughter mixed with tears. I mean, that's what he says the blues is, right? And so I'm really interested in, over and over again in my own poems, writing blues poems, but blues poems in their mode and tone and feeling much more than they are blues poems in their form. What I love about Suicide's Note is that much in the same way that a haiku does, it takes two very disparate things and puts them next to each other. Do you know what I mean? So it juxtaposes these things and it has us understand these two things in a very different way because we have to see them next to one another. And that's the power of accumulation and that's the power of juxtaposition, right? And part of what I want to do in my poems that I feel like I got from Langston Hughes, that I really do feel like I learned this from Langston Hughes, is over and over again in my poems, what I want to do is I want to get at the complexity of human life by showing that there is no violence without some tenderness involved. There is no tenderness without some violence involved. I mean, anybody who's had a baby knows this. So it seems to me impossible to get at that by any other medium other than poetry. I mean, that's what I really love about, that's what I love about art, right? But what I love about poetry in particular is that the work for me is, how do I get at actual complexities? How do I get at the things that are in this body, or in a people, or in a nation that are laid side by side and yet live wholeheartedly in that body? Things that seem at first contradictions. How do I make it so people, or so that I understand when I'm writing a poem, that they're not contradictions, they're part of the human condition? Does that answer you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to go back a little bit to something that you had said earlier about holding space both for what actually happened and for what else might have been, and carrying that forward in a poem in the way that you poetically engage moments in history. And you wrote about doubt and the line break, something that's really interested me. You said a line break, I really believe, is a moment of doubt, that in the process of writing, you don't break your line until you know that you have heightened doubt to the utmost. And I really love the way that you use line breaks in general. They often break where it carries forward one meaning, which of course holds even as it's undone and becomes something else in the next line. And so I was just wondering if you would say a little bit more about your relationship to doubt, or to the question in poetry, and how you think about crafting a doubt that can stand, or a space for not knowing precisely.
Yeah. Can I say this first? I think that I think doubt and our ownership of doubt and its opposite, which is faith, right? I think our ownership of those two things is of utmost importance to us as readers and as writers. And if we own those things, then we will have a much better understanding of why we are so misunderstood in the world. Part of the reason why people think it's okay to say sentences like, I hate poetry, is because people have never, we simply are not in any way, shape, form, or fashion trained or prepared for intimacy or vulnerability. And poems, by their very being, ask us for intimacy and vulnerability. The very things that we're supposed to not be showing in this world. We're told this from a very young age, not to be vulnerable, Poetry asks us to to be vulnerable. I mean, Muriel Rukeyser says poetry calls for what she calls a total response. I love it when total response, like that's everything. Total response, dang, and so people are justified in their distaste for poetry. And, you can leave them alone because they don't want to deal with a total response. And of course they don't want to deal. I mean, Claire, you love poems. You know what it's like to have a total response. You know what it's like to have the wind knocked out of you. And all you did was look at some ink on a page. like all I did was read today. Like, why did I have to go through all of this? Do you know what I'm saying? So I think that's very important, because I think if we can own that that's part of what we're doing, we're working with line breaks in order. And I know that poems don't have to be written in line breaks. Poems can be obviously written in prose. There is a such thing as prose poetry. And there are many poets proving that to us, from Sabrina Oremark to Claudia Rankin. But I am a poet of the line break. I'm a poet who values the line break just as much as I am a poet of the body. I'm a poet who values that in poetry. But I think if we can begin to own that, then we can also begin to make use of it and push it as far as it can possibly go in our work. So I think somewhere along the way in answering all of this, I forgot the last part of your question, but I'm just gonna keep talking just a little bit. So I wanna say this other thing just about folk who say stuff like, I don't like poetry. I don't think they really know that they don't like poetry. I think there's a certain amount of exposure that we have to art. I mean, nobody says, I don't like painting. I don't like photographs. I don't like films. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't like music. Like, that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because our exposure to those things are very different from our exposure to poems and to poetry. If we're in our cars to get from one place to another, or if you're in New York City to walk from one place to another, we are listening to music. And if a song comes on that we're really not excited about, we don't think that means we don't like music. We just keep driving our cars or walking from one building to the next building. And it's only when that certain song comes up, that one song that we really like, we're like riding around in our cars and like one song comes on and we're like, hey, that's my song. When that happens, that moment makes us think we like music. But how often does that happen? One for every 10 songs? And you like music? Like, seriously? And I think we could change our relationship to poetry, where if we expose ourselves to it and we expose other people to it, then they will have a different feeling about it. Because you shouldn't like a lot of poems. You should only like the poems that you like, just like you shouldn't like a lot of songs, or you shouldn't like every artist. You should like the artists you love, the singers you love. And I think it's important for us to remember that as we're moving through this world, being readers and writers, and sort of defending ourselves over and over again, that there's nothing really to defend, other than the fact that we are interested in being whole and looking at ourselves in the mirror, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm sorry, I missed part of your question about doubt because I got sidetracked.
No, that was great. Thanks. We have a lot of really good questions coming in through the chat window, so I'm going to ask some of those. Joe Race Boytel asks, can you speak to the role of survival and owning within your work, especially within recreated histories, sexuality, and claiming our bodies?
So I was born Nelson DeMarie III. And I had this idea, and I have a really tumultuous and even violent relationship to this day with my father. I mean, I think for both of us, it's sort of like a situation where before we talk to one another, we both have to like pray. Like before we see each other, we're both like, let me get myself together because I do not want to like knock him out and have to go to jail. So so that relationship had a lot to do with me wanting to change my name. I remember when my first poems came out and they had Nelson Demery III on them. I remember feeling like, oh my God, I can't even have this. Like he's on that too. You know what I mean? Like I want, and it was very important to me to have something that was my own, but it was also very important to me to recreate my life. There was a past that I had that for whatever reason, I had a lot of guilt and shame about. And there were things that I felt guilt and shame about that I knew somehow internally I had no business feeling guilt and shame about. And I understood that there was a way I needed to own the events of my life and that I needed to see the good in even those events. And that if I did not do that, I was going to kill myself. I somehow understood, Jericho, if you don't want to, well, I guess at that time, Nelson, if you don't want to kill yourself, you're going to have to look at everything that keeps popping up in your head from your past in a completely different way. And you're going to have to own it as something great and wonderful. And I didn't understand how to do that other than by creating a new person and working to become that person. And so I started with, the person's name, which was Jericho Brown. And I think that naming allowed me to quite literally be and become the person I want to be. And it allowed me to write 2 books of poetry. And it allowed me to see that I could indeed create my own life, that I am always at choice, that my thoughts are the most important thing to my life, and that good thoughts attract good thoughts, and then they become manifest in the world. Do you know what I mean? Like, I really do believe these things. I'm sorry to get all new agey. Okay, so what the hell does that have to do with poetry, right? So I think that same thing happens at the level of a word, right? That when we write a word down, when we write a poem, right, we are recreating over and over again new possibilities, new lives, new worlds. Does that make sense? And what I want to do when I write a poem and when I put a book together is I want to make a world. I mean, with every poem, I really do think, what is going on this planet? And then I finish the poem and I'm like, okay, now I got to go make a whole nother planet, right? I have to create beings. I have to create plant life. I have to create animals. do you know what I mean? And that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing when I write a poem. I think I answered your question, but I'm not sure because I don't remember. I started talking. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that was great. She was asking about the role of survival and owning within
Oh
your.
yeah. So then, and that's how the survival happens, right? For a long time, my survival was based on Essex Hemphill. For a long time, this is the truth about me. When I was 19 years old, I saw a poem by Essex Hemphill. And I said to myself, oh, I guess I'll kill myself after I read all of Essex Hemphill's poems. Like I really did. Like, isn't that crazy? Like, but this is really how I thought. Like, I really thought, oh, I really want to kill myself, but who wants to kill themselves? And this guy's written all these poems I like. I'll read these poems and then I'll kill myself. Do you know what I mean? And then after that, it was Toni Morrison. It was like, oh, this novel Sula is really good. I might as well read all of the novels of Toni Morrison and then I'll kill. So for a long time, this was like reading literature really did. Like when people say like reading literature saved my life, I'm like, oh yeah, baby. It really did. Like I had this idea that, oh, I probably need to get rid of myself, but I'm not gonna do it before I get through these paragraphs or these poems. Like I just want to know about this thing and then I'll do it. And then by the end of that, I didn't want to kill myself anymore. You know what I mean? So it held me on at just the right time.
Thank you. And I have a question also from Professor Evie Shockley, and poet, obviously.
Hey, Evie.
And she asks, what's the greatest challenge you are facing currently in your writing? Where does it lie and what's at stake for you?
Yeah, I'm writing a play right now, and the play is actually an adaptation of the first two books. So the greatest challenge, and I'm working with a director. We're collaborating right now. So the greatest challenge for me is moving people around and understanding exactly why certain characters that did not exist when I wrote the poems are saying the words from the poems. What was the second part? What is the second part of the question? Can you read it to me? Because
where does the challenge lie and what's at stake for you in it?
Yeah, and part of what's at stake for me, I mean, this wasn't my idea. I met a playwright and director named Snehal Desai, who liked my work and who said that we should work on an adaptation. And I said, okay, because I don't really believe in, when I met Nikki Giovanni when I was 21 years old. She came to Dillard University where I went to undergrad, and somebody asked her what was her advice for young writers, and she said, never say no. And I was like, wow, she's gonna get everybody pregnant. So, so ever since then, I've really been big on not saying no, and I don't. I mean, my friend Lamar Wilson, the poet, is always telling me, Jericho, you could just tell these people no. And I'm like, could I really? Can I really tell these people no? So, and I end up doing a lot of work that isn't writing because I don't say no. But I think that never say no attitude led me to believe that, I do need to move into other genres. So I've been working on fiction for a long time, and the challenge with that is just moving people around. Like, I get so excited about the writing of a sentence that I forget that I'm supposed to tell a story. And so those are the challenges. And I imagine the more I read and the more I work on these things, the more I'll get through these things, and things will happen. I literally have the first page of about 232 different short stories or novels, because I'm always like, wait, I have to say more. So yeah, I hope that answers Evie's question.
Yeah, actually, she also had sent in a question ahead of time that I really wanted to ask you as well. And her question was about teaching, and what's the relationship of your teaching to your writing? How does the former impact the latter? How closely do you hold them together, or do you work to keep them apart?
Yeah, I love teaching because it actually feels like helping young people write their poems there's something about the feeling for me that is akin to the feeling of writing a poem, right? Sitting with a student one-on-one or in a workshop, but definitely one-on-one, and just going through what their intentions are with a poem helps me better understand my own intentions for my poems, and getting them to the point, because young people have a hard time articulating. It's not that they don't know what their intentions are, it's just that they don't have the words just yet for articulating those intentions. And often there's a lot of shame around what those intentions might be. Do you know what I mean? Like, so they can articulate it, but they feel like, oh, this isn't something that you're supposed to say. And so it really is good for me because it puts me in a space where I have to be a very non-judgmental person. And the more I'm non-judgmental with other people, the more I can be that way with myself. So I think that's one way that it goes hand in hand with my writing. Because then when I get something that I don't want to deal with in a poem, I'm to the point now, I used to not be this way. I used to be really scared, but now I'm like looking for the scary thing. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I'm to the point now where when something bothers me, I'm like, oh my God, I think I have a poem. You know, I'm excited about the thing that's driving me crazy. Do you know what I'm saying? I also think though that on a more practical level, working with students has really been of use to me because it's helped me keep an open mind about different kinds of poetry, about different aesthetics. It has reintroduced me to poets that I may have dismissed in the past. It has kept me abreast of things. Because what happens is, you know, if you get a student, I mean, when you're teaching a class of 15 students, you're gonna get a student who needs Robert Duncan. You're gonna get a student who needs Dottie Lasky. You're gonna get a student who needs Claude McKay. You're gonna get a student who needs Gwendolyn Brooks. Do you understand what I mean? You're gonna get students who need these things, and I can't give them what they need if I don't know these very different things. Like that's how that happens. I can't lead them to what their influences will become or what their influences could possibly be if I too am not somehow influenced by very, very different things. And whether or not that comes out in my work to where, so my influence from somebody like John Ashbery, I don't think I necessarily sound like John Ashbery, but I know I wouldn't be a poet if he wasn't a poet. I don't think I sound particularly like a lot of the Black male poets who are writing in my generation today. But I know that if they did not exist, you know, were it not for people like Adrian Matika and Ross Gay and, you know, all those other Black men, like if they weren't putting out books, I would not be a poet. I need those books so I can have a better idea of what I want to do, what I have to say, what's already been said, what topics are out there to be said about, you know? So I think that's important to me.
Thank you. I have a question following from that, and particularly coming just off of these past weeks, but also in general. I was wondering how you think about balancing kind of the immediacy of the now, which is like often presented as just a series of crises which always need real attention, and then also making space for that in the classroom, but then holding space also to think about a longer tradition.
Well, okay, so this is a really good question, and I did get it in advance, and I've been thinking a lot about how I handle this. I think I've been really blessed with really great students who have things of the now, as you say, that they want to talk about in their poems and in their lives. And when things come up from the longer and larger tradition, they are very quick to point out the nowness in those things. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about Langston Hughes and how some of the things that we see him writing about in his poems are happening now in different ways. We know, everyone in this conversation today, no matter how many people are in it, know that lynching has yet to end in the United States of America. Just hadn't stopped. And lynching having not stopped but changing its form is one of the things that will come up in a class of mine, because my students are very aware of what's going on their TVs and on their Twitter timelines and on their Facebooks. And there are a lot of things that I don't know that they bring to me that I'm like, oh my God, this is, you know, another thing happening in this world today. For instance, war is always with us. Terrorism is always with us. You would think that terrorism started on September 11th. I don't know when terrorism was not with us, right? So those things are with us. And because they're with us in that way, I don't think I'm really conscious about negotiating the nowness and the longer tradition although I do think I do it all the time, I think it's much more like breathing to me. You don't have to think about it, but it's got to get done, right? Like, I'm one of these people. You mentioned that essay that I wrote, where I say every poem is a love poem, but I also say that every poem is a political poem, and I believe that. I'm old school in many ways and nationalist in many ways, that I think sometimes even worries me. But I'm still one of these people who think, the poem is either questioning or supporting the status quo. I mean, it's doing one or the other. And I want to write poems that question and that even change the status quo. I don't want to write poems that support the status quo. I want to write poems that actually make things happen, that make poems that make minds change. So they're hand in hand, and yet even if I go back as far as Wordsworth, I understand that Wordsworth is writing about commerce and economy and capitalism when he says the world is too much with us. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's really hard. It's really hard for me to delineate, well, this is what we do when we talk about the long tradition, and this is what we do when we talk about the now, because I don't really think about things in that way consciously. Does that answer you? I'm
Yeah,
so glad. I'm really glad. I thank God for this. I really do. And people laugh when I say this. I thank God every day that I'm Black. Um, and I thank God every day that I'm gay. The reason I thank God for that is because it allows me. I mean, this is why and people get frustrated with me getting frustrated about it. But the reason why I get frustrated with tactics toward erasure is that those tactics toward erasure mean to erase the fact that your experience, which can be different given your ethnic background or your sexuality or your cultural background, these things matter, and they allow you to see things that other people just might not see. And that's okay. Like, that's actually supposed to be the way it is. Like, I think, if there is a God, I think that's what God had in mind when he made people very different and from different places. Do you know what I'm saying? When he made people who like they chicken with a whole bunch of hot sauce on it, and people who like they chicken bland. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know that sounds really funny and almost silly, but I do think there's a purpose to that. And right now we're living in a dispensation where folks are still stuck on "I love you in spite of," when we actually could really be moving toward "I love you because of." I mean, whatever those in spite ofs are, we could also say "because of." We could also see all those things as adding, right? And what's happening today in this country is people think that they are doing someone a big favor because they love a Muslim. And it actually makes more sense that you love somebody because they're a Muslim, right? That understanding Islam might give you a better idea of Christianity. Seeing what ISIS does in the name of Islam should make you wonder, well, what have crazy people done in the name of Christianity? You could make a list. And then you would have all kinds of compassion for people who are Muslim and have to deal with ISIS being their damn representative. Do you know what I'm saying? It's just that kind of love that I'm much more interested in as a writer and as a citizen, as a person, as a brother, So I hope I don't even remember the question, but I hope I answered it.
yeah, thank you. We're running out of time, so I'll just ask one more that's coming from Keisha Washington.
Am I answering too long?
No, it's great. There's a lot to talk about.
Let me look at some of these questions before you ask. When you are creating a poem, is it a solitary experience, or do you share drafts with others while they are still in process? I share drafts after I finish a poem, I call a person, I call James, or I call James Hall, my friend, or Michael Dumanis, and I'll read them the poem, and then they'll say something. But I generally don't finish everything until I finish everything. So I have to look at a few poems in order to revise a few poems. How do you know when a poem is finished? I have no idea how to answer that question. Can you talk a little bit about biblical allusion in your work? I grew up in the church, so biblical allusion is sort of a part of my life. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, where you know, people are looking for ketchup on aisle 9, and when they find the ketchup, they say, "Amen." Cynthia, hey, Cynthia Manick. How do you deal with your family's reaction to your work? My family doesn't really read my work. I feel that if I was an architect and I built a mall, or designed a mall, I should say, I wouldn't expect my family to come walk through the mall. If I was a cashier at Piggly Wiggly, I wouldn't expect my mom to stand behind me while I was checking people out. And what brings you joy in writing and in life? Well, what brings me joy is doing stuff like this and talking to y'all. And I really like interacting with people and talking about poetry. Now you can ask your last question.
Well, I was just actually going to ask Keisha's was the last question.
Oh, really? Is there another last question? Wait, Keisha, can you talk a lot? You want me to talk a little bit more about biblical allusion? Yeah, so I'll talk about biblical allusion. I think it's really important that we make use of what we know in our work. And, you know, when I was a kid, the Bible was preached and teached. We didn't just go to church one on Sunday. If they had church on Wednesday or Thursday or Monday night, we were there too. My mother was a mother who told me and my sister, you can either join the youth usher board, you can join the youth choir, or you can go to jail. I still don't know what that means. I don't know why she said that, but I am so glad she said it, because it put me in contact with a certain kind of vernacular, certain ways of speaking. It put me in contact with biblical stories, with archetypes that are already just sort of set up for me, that I can make use of, and that I can find myself in. I think what's really useful to us when we are looking at any mythology is that we figure out, how are we any one of the characters in that mythology? So, you know, not only how am I Cain, but also how am I Abel? Not only how am I Isaac, but how am I Abraham? Do you understand what I'm saying? And so I'm really interested in that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Would you close us out with a poem?
Yeah, I'll close us out with a poem. Sure, I can do that. I'll read the first poem from the New Testament. It's short. It's called Colosseum. I'm kind of proud of this poem because I wrote it. You know how like sometimes you have to get up in the middle of the night and use the restroom? I wrote it using the restroom on the way back from the restroom. Colosseum. I don't remember how I hurt myself, the pain mine long enough for me to lose the wound that invented it, as none of us knows the beauty of our own eyes until a man tells us they are why God made brown. Then that same man says he lives to touch the smoothest parts, suggesting our surface area can be understood by degrees of satin. Him I will follow until I am as rough outside as I am within. I cannot locate the origin of slaughter, but I know how my own feels, that I live with it and sometimes use it to get the living done. Because I am what gladiators call a man in love, love being any reminder we survived.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Y'all are the absolute best. Thank y'all. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
And please join us for our 5th webinar in this series. Jessica Care Moore on Tuesday, November 19th at 4 p.m. Central Time. We'd like to thank KU's Ermel Geringer Academic Resources Center staff for making today's webinar possible. Special thanks to our guest, Professor Jericho Brown, for being here today. And most of all, thanks to each of you for sharing this exciting event with us. A downloadable podcast from today's webinar will be available on our website soon. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us online on the HBW website, on Twitter, and on our blog about events related to Black writing. See you on Tuesday, November 19th at 4 p.m. for Jessica Caremore.